Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, Sam Coleman, the Freedom Foundation's California director, stopped by our Sacramento office for a conversation with Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and me by phone on their efforts to inform union members of their First Amendment rights after the Supreme Court's Janus decision in 2018. The Janus ruling, one of the most important labor law cases in decades, ruled that non-union members no longer have to pay agency fees or union dues to their union. Up until that time, in California and many other states, even if you don't belong to the union, you still had to pay dues. The Freedom Foundation is focused on informing union members of their choices and alternatives. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round, Sam.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So first, for our listeners who aren't familiar with the Freedom Foundation, talk about your organization and its mission and your role as California director.
Sure. So the Freedom Foundation, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We have offices in Washington, Oregon, and California. Our mission is to fight for the ideals of individual liberty, free market economics, and a smaller and more accountable government. My role as the California director is to manage our canvassing operations, reach out to public workers, and help these hardworking people make difficult decisions about their union membership.
Your big project, obviously, in the aftermath of the Janus decision is talking to, hopefully, some disaffected union workers about their First Amendment rights to opt out of paying union dues. So could you talk about some of these efforts, particularly what you're doing here in California?
We've sent out hundreds of thousands of emails to CTA members, Teamsters, all the big ones. We've sent out tens of thousands of mailers as well, and we've visited more than 10,000 public workers at their place of work. Our canvassers work across the state to visit workers where their union's presence is the most noticeable, and that's at their workplace. Our canvassing teams visit hundreds of public workers every month, and our goal is to one day visit every single worker in the state.
So Sam, how have public sector workers reacted to your message after informing them of their rights? Do you think they are more likely to leave their union, or are you finding that workers are pretty loyal?
Well, what we found is that most public workers don't even know that they have the right to opt out. They think that if they do, they'll lose their wages, they'll lose their vacation time, their sick leave, they won't get any raises. Basically, they think that their collective bargaining agreement won't apply to them anymore, and that's not true. And the reason for this really is because some of these unions have been very deceptive with how they've gone about informing public workers about the Janus decision. They make it sound like if you opt out, you're going to lose everything, and that's just not true. Most public workers we speak to and who we explain this to, they're happy to hear it. They're happy to hear that they can save this money. That's extra food on the table. That's a month of rent. It's big money to some of these public workers.
So let's talk about that issue of cost and value for a moment. Just living here, we know that California has perhaps the highest costs of living in the entire country. Union dues here can run as high as $1,000 or $1,500 per worker, and that's a pretty steep price to pay for anything, let alone union membership. So what kind of value are these members really getting for their $1,000 or $1,500 a year, and are there alternatives to such a high cost every year?
Well, this is a really great question. In my opinion, value is really determined by what the public worker believes they're getting or what the worker needs. For example, my mother is a public worker in Washington State, and she was a fee payer, meaning that she paid about 80% of regular union dues pretty much since day one because she didn't want to buy into the politics. She never believed that the union really did much of anything for her. She thought that she could, if she had the power to do so, she'd be able to bargain a much better contract for herself. And I think there's a lot of public workers out there like her that are just looking to stand up for themselves. They don't need someone to stand up for them. So teachers often pay the highest dues of any classification of employee. For them, there are plenty of options. For one, the Christian Teachers Association charges about $250 a year for membership. membership and comes with $2 million worth of liability insurance, handful of other professional tools. There's other non-religious organizations that offer a similar package, and the reason they're able to charge such a small amount is because they're not political entities and they're not as bloated as some of these larger unions are.
Let's talk about that liability insurance a little more. I know some teachers who really that's their biggest fear is to be sued, and they believe that being part of the union will help them with their legal fees and so forth. But that's not actually the case. Some union members, depending on the issue, or unions, depending on the issue, may not help the teacher or the government worker. Talk about this a little bit more and what the alternatives are out there. For example, I know you can get insurance for as little as $90, $100 a year from other providers if you want to exit your union.
Absolutely. I mean, like you said, this liability insurance problem, this is the big problem for teachers. It's a reality for some teachers that there might be a student who doesn't like them and they might accuse them of doing some pretty heinous things. And many teachers might not see the alternatives around them, but they're out there. Like I said, there's the Christian Teachers Association. There's a few other ones that aren't religious, and most of them, you'll get this full package for $250 yearly. That's 20% of what you'll pay in regular union dues for the CTA. We've seen some teachers getting charged as much as $1,400 a year. So that's just an insane amount, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the other part of the money where dues go to. A lot of it goes to political causes and candidates. And for example, here in California, the nurses union is heavily supporting single payer in the state. And the irony is that if California becomes a single payer state, nurses could see their paychecks decline and the quality of healthcare reduced for California, which is what Canadians and the British people are seeing today. Talk about other political causes where dues may be going to that members might not necessarily agree with.
Sure, that's a great point. We know that between 20 and 30% of union dues go directly to politics, not representation. The big issue here is that people don't know that their unions are actually political engines. They think that it's just sort of a side mission that they have. So for example, Teamsters International, they spent $3.8 million on political contributions and $5.1 million on lobbying in the 2018 political cycle. AFSCME spent $13.3 million in political contributions and nearly $5 million in lobbying. And the NEA, arguably the largest union in the country, right next to AFL-CIO, the NEA spent $20.6 million in political contributions and $5.5 million in lobbying. So this is big money that's going into ideas that are really hurting California. A couple examples are the 15 for all minimum wage. That one is pretty widely criticized by most economists as just a bad idea. Denial of pension reform, denial of benefits reform are just a few that we can point to that are costing California millions of dollars a year that we just can't seem to do anything about.
So the most famous, I would say, recent example that we have of this sort of disconnect is the teacher strike in Los Angeles Unified School District. And it was a battle over all of these issues. Ironically, Los Angeles Unified is where we had several serious examples of teacher misconduct in recent years, and I'm sure their union did not cancel their liability insurance, and they actually fought our efforts when I worked in the legislature to adopt teacher misconduct reform and protect children from pervs in the classroom, as we might say. So Lance Izumi, who's our director of education, has written about the consequences of the settlement that they ultimately reached. And that it could really put the entire school district in financial peril. And you could see more teachers being let go because the deal is simply unsustainable. Talk about some of these messaging challenges in breaking through to teachers who are often being led by union leaders to their detriment?
Sure. So much like recently in LA, in Oakland, we've seen that teachers have been emboldened by the LA strike and have decided that, it's their turn. But what we know about the Oakland School District is they're already looking at making $60 million worth of cuts. There's no extra money laying around. What's really interesting about Oakland, too, is the OEA, the Oakland Education Association, which is the union for the Oakland teachers. They're looking at a 12% raise, while the LA teachers demanded a 6%. So, the question is really needs to be asked here. Can the district afford this? And if they can't, what's going to happen to these teachers who need to be let go? Are they just going to have to move and find a new job? Or, what's the solution here? Teachers can be a particularly difficult group to break through to. Unfortunately, teachers have become something of a punching bag for a lot of groups in the country who don't really want to face the root of their problems. Many teachers really believe that their union is the last group that has their back, even though they have what many could describe as an abusive relationship with their union. In California, the Peer Assistance and Review Program, which is a brainchild of the California Teachers Association, is a way of forcing out older teachers who don't go along with the CTA's vision of the world or the district's demands. The union should be standing up for its members here. They shouldn't be allowing the district to force out their teachers just because, they're getting up there in years or because they don't like some things the district or the CTA does. The CTA is really selling them out here. Breaking through to teachers really is a goal that the Freedom Foundation has, because we don't believe that they're being treated right by their union, and we believe that there's a lot of them that want to take their voice back, that don't want to be giving thousands of dollars to them every year and getting nothing in return. The question really here is, how do you do that, especially when the union really controls the narrative at these schools?
Let's talk about union corruption. Sure, there are reported cases of embezzlement and fraud, but there are also unreported cases, union activities that aren't illegal, but certainly are kind of shady. For example, padding union leaders' salaries for these quote-unquote extracurricular activities and work. What advice would you give to workers who suspect that these things are happening in their union?
Well, what I would say is blow the whistle. If you see something, say something. And more to the point, say something to us. The Freedom Foundation wants to hear about it. If PERB weren't so union friendly, I would say go ahead and file a PERB complaint. But better yet, come talk to us and we'll do it for you. We have an excellent legal team here in California, and this is exactly the kind of thing we want to help public workers with.
Can they be anonymous?
Well, if we're going to court, probably not. They'd probably have to, and this is a great point too, and this is something that we tell people a lot when they call in, is they want to do something, but they don't want to be identified, and we always have to tell people, if you want to see change, someone needs to stand up and say something. We can't just stand behind this anonymous barrier and hope that things will change. It just doesn't work like that.
But they can also kind of give you a tip, at least.
They can. Absolutely, yeah.
So obviously the Janus ruling has unions preparing for a significant financial hit. I know CTA said publicly last year in the immediate aftermath of the ruling that they expect to lose $20 million just for politics alone, and I'm sure they're not alone. So to make up for this shortfall, some unions have considered astonishingly hiking their fees. The law of economics shows us that the higher the price, the fewer the buyers. So what can these unions do to prove their value to their members, and what reforms, if any, could they make?
Well, the first and most obvious reform is to stop spending so much money on politics. Focus on the worker. This has been in my mind for a long time. Why don't unions figure out a way to continue supporting workers after the fact? After they've, moved out of public work, or after they've, been injured, why aren't unions looking to do more for these people? There's some unions in Washington that open a retirement savings account with a portion of their dues. So they're really actually taking their money and putting it into something that helps workers. So why aren't more unions doing this? And it's fairly obvious they want to spend money on politics. They're not really interested in the worker, and they're kind of just trying to figure out, how do we spend as little as possible while still maximizing our budget?
So in 5 years, do you think public union membership will increase or decrease in California, and will public sector workers be better off or worse off?
This is a really good question, and I think it depends on how the unions react to Janus. If they continue to spend wildly on politics and they're ignoring their members, union membership will certainly decrease. If they start making real reforms, and I mean worker-centric reforms, they might make it. Either way, the days of forced unionization are over, and the power is back in the people's hands, and it really is time to see how public worker unions react to this new reality, if they're going to be able to survive or not.
Well, finally, we always like to end on a light note. And we've covered a lot of heavy issues in our podcast today. And certainly you've had a lot of work up to now, and you have a lot of work going forward. So we always like to toast our discussion of public policy and free market ideas with a recommendation for a wine or beer or cocktail for our listeners to enjoy. So perhaps being a stone's throw away from wine country, you have a good recommendation or two for our listeners.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not much for wine, but I can recommend a good brew. The Mare Island Brewery in Vallejo, California makes an excellent golden ale called the Saginaw, which is actually named after a ship that was created at the old naval base there on Mare Island. And my grandfather actually served on Mare Island back in the day, so this one's a little special to me, and it is delicious.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Pleasure to be here.
If you're a union member and interested in learning about the Janus ruling and your right to opt out of paying union dues, go to the Freedom Foundation's website at freedomfoundation.com for more information. So here's a few announcements. On February 28th, PRI is holding a day-long policy conference in Sacramento, followed by, of course, wine tasting. On Saturday, March 23rd, Tucker Carlson will be our keynote speaker at our 40th anniversary gala in San Francisco. Details for both events are on our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.